I'd like to echo Arkadi's comments or expression of gratitude for being invited to this conference and for the hospitality of the hosts. The title of my paper, just to remind you, is Yiddish Language Travelogues as Historical Sources for Soviet Jewish Life in the 1930s. And I'm going to read in English. Reflecting on his travels to the Soviet Union in 1932, the Yiddish writer and Vorwärts editor Mendel Osherovich expressed amazement at how many Westerners he encountered on the road in the Soviet Union. In his travelogue, Wie Menschen leben in Soviet Russland, Eindruck von Reise, or How People Live in Soviet Russia, Impressions from a Journey, he has almost as much to say about Western visitors to the Soviet Union as he does about Soviet citizens. So dramatic is the number of foreign tourists in the Soviet Union that Osherovich devotes an entire chapter to the subject, which he entitles, quote, What Americans See and What They Don't See in Soviet Russia, unquote. And he takes the opportunity to mercilessly ridicule the American intelligentsia, and particularly the so-called professors from colleges and universities who travel in the summers to study the Soviet experiment. Most of them, however, see only what the Soviet agency Interest wants them to see. And here Osherovich introduces a theme that he returns to repeatedly throughout his travelogue, the discrepancy between the Soviet Union of theory and the Soviet Union of reality. American intellectuals, and here he's not necessarily distinguishing between Jewish or non-Jewish, he complains, stay mostly in the big cities, particularly Moscow, live in fancy hotels and go on guided tours of factories and museums. Once they gather enough information to write an article, or maybe even a book, they stop looking further and go back home to transmit their superficial impressions of this theoretical Soviet Union to their American readers. To his exasperation, these Western visitors perpetuate a cycle of misinformation, conveying what he calls half-truths, which he contends can be far more dangerous even than full-blown lies. Both Jewish and non-Jewish visitors alike, he complains, claim to be experts on the Soviet Union, but he argues that they are only looking at the master narrative of modernity, that of steel and iron, and fail to see the real people behind this facade. Without knowledge of local languages, and for Osherovich this means primarily Russian, Ukrainian, and Yiddish, and without contact with ordinary people, it is simply impossible to understand anything at all about the Soviet Union. Wie Menschen leben in Soviet Russland, however, was intended by Osherovich to serve as an antidote. Born in the shtetl Trostinets in Podolia in 1888, Osherovich came to the United States and settled in New York City around 1910, where he became a prolific Yiddish writer and eventually an editor at the newspaper The Vorwärts, where he also served as the chief correspondent for Russian matters. His trip to the Soviet Union in 1932 marked his first time back to the land of his birth in over 20 years. In contrast to the gullible tourists and political dilettantes that he encounters during his travels, Osherovich claims to occupy a privileged position as one who is simultaneously an insider with the requisite language skills and knowledge of the country, and a well-informed outsider, capable of balanced critique. While his trip is in large part personal, he returns to his shtetl to visit his mother and the siblings that he left over 2 decades earlier. It is also an attempt to offer an objective, dispassionate portrait of a society that has embarked on a grand experiment, and as it becomes clear in the course of his less than dispassionate account, a tragic experiment. But as brutal as current-day life is for the vast majority of Soviet citizens, Osherovich also promises his readers that he will convey the positive elements of Soviet reality, not only the negatives. His goal, he states at the outset, is to describe rather than to criticize, and to report only what he sees with his own eyes, steering clear of the distracting polemics that dominate other Western travelogues. Having said that, however, Osherovich proceeds to do precisely that, to criticize and polemicize, but he does so by keeping the focus on what he believes is most important, namely ordinary people, both Jews and non-Jews, and their day-to-day lives. Mendel Osherovich is one of several Americanized Jewish visitors to the Soviet Union discussed by the historian Daniel Sawyer in his 2000 article, Back to the Future, American Jews Visit the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s. And in this article, Sawyer explores the significance of travel to the Soviet Union for American Jewish intellectuals and their Yiddish readers during the interwar period. For both observers and readers alike, Sawyer demonstrates, these travel accounts served as vehicles for exploring their evolving identities as American Jews and as socialists. These accounts also provided an opportunity for the Soviet regime to gauge and to some extent even influence the propaganda wars waged in the Western Yiddish press about the communist experiment. And in reading this material and thinking about it for this presentation, my focus is not so much on the identity politics of American Jewish observers, which is the focus of Sawyer's very good article, but rather the content of the Yiddish language travelogue and its value as a historical source for understanding the Jewish experience in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Particularly for a non-specialist audience that has no access to Yiddish. And in this case, I'm thinking in particular of this as a resource for the multi-volume history of Jews in the Soviet Union. And here I think it's worth underscoring that Osherovich's travelogue is entitled How People Live in Soviet Russia, not How Jews Live in Soviet Russia. To be sure, his account focuses on Jews and Jewish identity, but his gaze constantly moves back and forth, zooming out to take stock of the general Soviet landscape, and then zooming back in to explore that which is distinctive to the Jewish experience. For Osherovich, Soviet life cannot be understood without reference to the broader picture. And this integrated approach, which seems so self-evident to Osherovich as a contemporary observer that he felt no need to explain it, is what makes his travelogue, I think, a valuable but still surprisingly underutilized resource for us today. So rather than try to summarize a travelogue of nearly 400 pages in a short presentation, I'm just going to highlight really just a few examples of his observations and reflections during his journeys to cities, shtetls, peasant villages, and so forth, that stood out to me, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but we should bear in mind that Osherovich always, he prided himself in using third class, or the hard class, you know, where you had to sit on the hard benches with other people. He ridiculed those who took first class and claimed that they could understand anything about the Soviet Union. And as he goes through his itinerary, he encounters a very broad range of Soviet citizens, ranging from white-collar workers to peasants, and again, not just Jews, plenty of non-Jews as well. Significantly, though, he almost never names names, presumably to protect his new acquaintances. So he recounts much bitterness that is expressed by Soviet citizens, but he doesn't, we have to bear in mind also in terms of being critical of this source, that he doesn't give names. So just a couple of highlights. He observes, for example, that Americans, and again, I'm getting back here to Americans for a minute because his comments about them are so interesting, but he says Americans really have no concept of the terror wielded by the Soviet secret police, who are everywhere and not always in uniform. They could be your neighbor, your washwoman, the person working at the cafeteria. No one really knows who's reporting on whom. The ubiquity of the GPU, he adds, is indicative not of a strong country, but a weak one. Underscoring the darker side of upward mobility for Soviet Jews, he recounts how his first encounter with a GPU officer coincides with the very first word of Yiddish that he encounters in the country when he is questioned at the border before entering the Soviet Union. A non-Jewish border official summons a Jewish colleague because he doesn't know what to do with Osherovich's Yiddish language materials, and asks his colleague to scrutinize these publications. And in this respect, he goes on, and so he's drawing a very clear connection between the GPU and upward mobility for Jews. And he also says this is another reason that foreigner visitors can't, even when they go beyond Moscow, even when they don't take first class, they can't really understand Soviet reality because Soviet citizens themselves have learned to conflate truth and lies in order to survive within the system, so that individuals who are visiting from outside don't really know how to read between the lines, and this is in large part connected to the ubiquity of the GPU. More impressions. In Moscow, he describes a peculiar fusion of old and new, which he sums up as a conflation of old Russia, the spirit of Ivan Grozny, and modernity, the electrificatia of Thomas Edison. He also nicely captures the disorientation experienced on a day-to-day basis by Soviet citizens due to the post-revolutionary renaming of streets and institutions. Even Soviet officials, who should know, he claims, cannot keep track of the politically correct topography of the city, and virtually nobody can help him when Osherovich asks for directions to Frunze Street. Virtually everyone, he notices, references the physical space of the Soviet present in terms of the pre-revolutionary past, constantly employing the term former, bывший in Russian, and even addressing mail sent through the post office to streets and towns formerly known by their imperial-era designations. Osherovich's misgivings about the status of Jewish culture in the Soviet Union comes to the fore during a visit to the Mendele Moichosvorim Museum in Odessa. While he is extremely impressed with one single room in the museum devoted to the great-grandfather of Yiddish literature, and here this is a rare moment of being very positive and complimentary on the part of Osherovich, everything else in the museum strikes him as politically tendentious, dominated by installations devoted to anti-religious campaigns and the history of the putative union of the Jewish religious authorities with the Tsarist regime. And he tells his reader, if the great writer Mendele Moichosvorim could rise from his grave today and see what kind of a museum had been created in his name, and if he was not too afraid of the GPU himself, he would strike the plaque of the museum bearing his name with his cane and demand that be taken down because the museum had nothing to do with his life or his writings. And as if to prove the point, Osherovich observes that very few visitors to the museum seem to be Jewish. How he is identifying Jews or non-Jews is not entirely clear, but he says most are in fact Christians, and he uses the term Christians to refer to visitors to the museum, even though they're Soviet citizens. What impression, then, he wonders, must this museum give to those visitors with little knowledge of Jewish history? What are they to make of that grand narrative based on this museum? They would be under the impression that Jewish history is all about the sinister union of the rabbinate and the Jewish bourgeoisie with the Tsarist autocracy, and nothing more. Nowhere will they find the great Jewish socialist heroes who were so important for the story of late imperial Russia and even the early years of the Soviet Union. Osherovich's enthusiasm for Russian culture rises to the surface, and here he shows himself to be truly an enthusiast for great Russian culture, opera, ballet, the theater, and so forth. He attends a ballet performance in Odessa, arguing that the Russian performing arts are the best in the world. Nobody has ever surpassed them. And so profound and soulful are the country's stage performers, even in the Soviet period, that Western visitors who have no knowledge of Russian or other languages can find themselves extremely moved by a theatrical or operatic performance simply because of the soul that goes into and the talent that goes into the performances. Yet the Soviet regime cannot take credit for this. This was the case even before the revolution. The only difference is now that ordinary people, workers, militiamen, and so forth, can themselves benefit from these cultural offerings. And also another moment that sort of brings together or juxtapose both Jews and non-Jews in his observations, when Osherovich leaves the cities and goes homeward bound to Trostinets, and he's entering into the deep provinces of Ukraine, he has to make multiple train changes. And so he's waiting at a provincial train station en route to his native shtetl. And he is sitting in the train station and notices on the walls that there are all sorts of propagandistic pictures depicting Soviet achievements, tractors, collective farms, factories, and so forth. And because he's although he tries to blend in and knows the language, he's immediately recognizable as a foreigner, and most figure out that he's American. So there are all sorts of Yiddish-speaking young children who happen to be at the vokzal who surround him, and they try to point out the pictures, thinking he doesn't understand, and to explain their content. And they say to him, "Look, we're building great things in the Soviet Union too." Everything being sort of a reference to America. We have factories. We now plow the fields with tractors. We have factories here. And a group of Ukrainian peasants, he notices, is sitting nearby, sullen and silent, observing the scene. And suddenly one elderly Ukrainian peasant interrupts and, speaking in Ukrainian to the children, chastises them for regurgitating state propaganda, saying that what they should be doing is telling the American visitor how terrible life is, particularly in the countryside, and how people and their children are swollen with hunger. Something that Osherovich happened to be very well aware of in any case. And Osherovich, realizes he doesn't address Osherovich himself, but Osherovich says he doesn't know that I speak Ukrainian and I can understand. And on that subject, he finds it very disconcerting that he is recognizable as an American because of his dress and his appearance. Because especially, he says, for the last 23 years in America, I was always the Russian. I've never been able to escape my Russianness. And now here I come back home and I'm an American. And everybody points to me and says, look at the American. And he also comes to realize that the eyes of the people of his native shtetl, and here he's very saddened to realize he doesn't recognize anyone, even those people who were already adults at the time that he left, because they've aged so considerably and wear very poor clothing, tattered clothing, and so forth. But he becomes conscious of being the man with the suitcase, the man with the chumadan. And this is because he's carrying his suitcase around with him, and people see the suitcase and they see it as a symbol of freedom. And they see that with his suitcase, he can pack up and leave and go back to the United States whenever he wants. And he becomes very self-conscious of being the man with the chumadan. Just to sort of, to sum up a little bit, Osherovich's initial claim to neutrality in the introduction to his travelogue is undermined on virtually every page of his work. It is manifestly clear that he views the first 5-year plan as the cause of tremendous human suffering and the Soviet Union as a whole as a tragic and dangerous experiment. But even if his pretense of objectivity seems disingenuous, his critique of other Western observers in the early 1930s may very well resonate with 21st century readers today, who also consume journalistic reportage about today's Russia. Like readers in the interwar period, we too are regularly presented with journalistic accounts filtered through a variety of ideological perspectives and with certain topics selectively recycled at the expense of others. In an interesting passage, Osherovich astutely observes that many Western visitors even exoticize the Soviet Union, engaging in what we today might refer to as a kind of Orientalism, writing about it as if it were, in his words, some kind of India or Brazil, a place where the telltale signs of modernity are not expected by condescending Westerners who respond to the sight of a factory saying, it's just like in the USA, or upon seeing young women who know how to dance the foxtrot with a patronizing exclamation, "Isn't that wonderful?" And here Osherovich seems to deliberately mimic the Yiddish accented English of a typical American Jewish visitor to the Soviet Union. Osherovich had already reached his conclusions about the nature of the Soviet regime before writing his book, but his verbal snapshots of a society in flux leave the reader with a sense of open-endedness. We do not yet know where this story is going to go. After all, it was recording his experiences of 1932. And the author's firsthand observations, I think, can give 21st century readers a rare sense of the immediacy and texture of life in Soviet Rusland. Thank you.